Hello, everyone. My name is Marcy Marr, and I work with the Kootenai Conservation Program, or KCP. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Kendall Benish, also here on behalf of KCP. Haley Ross from CMI is away this week, so Kendall and I will be your webinar hosts today. KCP and the Columbia Mountains Institute of Applied Ecology, or CMI, have again joined forces to present the 8th season of CMI's CRED Talks, the Columbia Region Ecological Discussions, and KCP's 10th season of Winter Webinars. We would like to acknowledge that the region in which both organizations work is the unceded homeland of the Sinixt, Shuswap, Ktunaxa, and Syilx Okanagan people who have stewarded and cared for the land, water, and all living things since time immemorial. Now I invite you to make your own acknowledgement as well, and using the chat, please feel free to introduce yourself and let us know whose territory you are zooming in from today. This season of webinars, we have been exploring the theme of wildlife corridors and ecological connectivity. We invited 8 speakers to discuss this theme from different perspectives and provide a wide view that can inform the conservation of connected and resilient landscapes in the Columbia Basin. Thanks for tuning in today for our 8th and final webinar, where Justina Ray will explore the essential role that unfragmented, unroaded, and undeveloped lands and waters play in sustaining biodiversity and landscape connectivity, and the particular responsibility that Canada bears for this theme when it comes to the domestic implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Dr. Justina Ray will be joined by co-author Dr. Lucy Poley, who will be participating in the Q&A. This year's series is financially supported by the Columbia Basin Trust and LGL Limited, and many thanks to these organizations for ensuring we can offer this series free of charge. So as introductions and acknowledgements flow in the chat, we'd like to tell you a bit more about CMI and KCP. CMI is a nonprofit society and an association for people working in the various fields of ecology. CMI provides professional development opportunities in the form of conferences, courses, and webinars that address everything from skill-based research techniques to land management conundrums. Their website is the best place to learn more and contains great resources such as proceedings, documents, and talk recordings from all of their major events. And I'd like to now pass it over to Kendall.
Thanks, Marcy. Kootenai Conservation Program is a diverse network of more than 85 land and water conservation and stewardship groups, federal, provincial, and local governments, First Nations, land trusts, agricultural producers, and ecological educational institutions who all contribute to conserving our region. The purpose of KCP's partnership is to cooperatively conserve and steward landscapes that sustain biodiversity and naturally functioning ecosystems, and to generate the support and resources needed to advance this effort, which includes building technical knowledge in webinars like this. We're very excited to be hosting this webinar series again with CMI, and would like to give an additional thanks to all of our program sponsors, without whom we really wouldn't be able to support this type of work. And just a couple final housekeeping details from me, and then we'll get started. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted within a week to both CMI's event webpage and KCP's Winter Webinar Series webpage. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please use the Q&A button in your Zoom toolbar to add questions into the queue, and we'll do our best to make our way through them. You can also utilize the upvote button or the thumbs up button in the Q&A. So if you see a question that's similar to yours or that you'd also like answered, press that button by the question that you like. And that's it. Back to you, Marcy.
Thanks, Kendall. And so I'd like to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Justina Ray. Justina has been president and senior scientist of Wildlife Conservation Society Canada since its incorporation in 2004. In addition to overseeing the operations of WCS Canada, Justina is involved in research and policy initiatives associated with land use planning and large mammal conservation in northern landscapes. Justina has been appointed to numerous government advisory panels related to policy development for species at risk and land use planning in Ontario and Canada. She was the co-chair of the Terrestrial Mammals Subcommittee of the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, or COSEWIC, from 2009 to 2017, and is currently a member of the IUCN Taskforce on Biodiversity and Protected Areas. Welcome, Justina. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Lucy Poley. Lucy has a background conducting research on wildlife and habitat interactions at both landscape and site scales, using tools such as aerial surveys, drones, satellite imagery, and field assessments, and in varied environments, including the boreal forest, the Rocky Mountains, and the tundra. More recently, in her role as the Ecosystem Criteria Coordinator for the Key Biodiversity Areas, or KBA, initiative in Canada, she has taken an ecosystem-based approach to conservation, looking at how to best map and understand the condition and distribution of ecosystems in areas of globally significant high ecological integrity, as well as their threats and persistence in increasingly developed world. Thank you both for joining us today, and I'll ask you, Justina, to share your slides. And you're still muted in case you're trying to communicate with us.
There we go. I shouldn't be muted anymore, I hope. Okay. So thank you so much for this invitation. It's been such an illustrious group of speakers that I've joined at the end. I've heard almost every presentation, so that it provides a terrific kind of introduction to what I'd like to say today. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-author, Lucy Poley, who will be here during questions. And then also just do my own acknowledgement, because I am not in the Kootenays today. I'm in Toronto, and this is the most highly converted area of Canada, very germane to the topic that we'll be talking about today, and the territory of the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee people. For me personally, acknowledging this history reminds me that this intensely settled urban landscape does sit on the lands and waters of peoples who've been deeply connected, at least at one time. And this is something that those profound connections is something that we cannot lose sight of as we continue to convert the world. And so that provides me a really important touchstone. I'm also here, and so is Lucy, representing WCS Canada. We are in our 20th anniversary year here in Canada, and we operate as an organization at the Science Policy Interface with a mix of kind of long-term field programs that are depicted on the left side of this schematic, and increasingly a set of national scale initiatives that give us a broader voice. In the western part of the country, in particular in this area in the Kootenays, the Western Bat Program has been operating for quite some time. We're a proud partner of the KCP, and work on a myriad of strategies to conserve, restore, and work with bats in all over the Columbia Basin, all 12 species in various ways. And so we're proud to be part of that partnership. And as I've been watching the talks and reflecting on them, it is so key how much evidence has amassed about the amazing ability of animals to navigate across the horrible landscapes that we've created. And my biggest image on that is from cougars in the Southern California, and this image captures that so importantly. And we've created all these barriers. We've made it as hard and difficult as it can be, and animals themselves can navigate across this area. But it is so difficult. And we saw quite a few of these kind of depictions through the webinars here, like Michael Proctor showed us the painful journeys of several of these individual bears going across these barriers and so forth. And it's really important to keep that in mind as we continue to build out and then also try and restore this. I also thought it was important to highlight to anybody who hasn't noticed this in this audience, as I reflected on the topic of my talk, that an announcement last week by the Biden administration that they were investing a significant amount of money to rebuild communities that have themselves been divided by infrastructure. And this notion of high integrity communities that get all of a sudden a huge highway built right in the middle of them, and the enormous damage that that's caused, the displacement, the surrounding roads being widened to traffic, and disrupting people who live, work, and shop in these neighborhoods for such a long time. And the notion of rebuilding them and how difficult that's going to be. But it does provide us perspective of that connectivity matters so much for humans as well. And so in speaking of repairing past harms, I was also struck by the presentations of the ingenuity and the lengths that we go to repair the damage that we've done through these extraordinary structures that restore connectivity as best as possible. The fact remains that it's so much more costly to do it this way than to keep things in good shape in the first place. But we've normalized this. Thank goodness we're doing it, because it would be a disaster if otherwise. But we also have to keep sight of what it is that we are trying to repair. And that is kind of our want as conservation biologists. We're sort of constantly in a crisis mode. We operate in that way every day. We come in, we're the ones that come in to repair things that after the damage has been done, when we weren't even considered in the decision-making process to get it that way. And it sort of reflects like conservation biology as a discipline was invented kind of as a crisis. It was in 1988 when the first sort of papers emerged about what this is and the problems that it was addressing. And then similarly, this notion of hotspots that come out in the world of areas where we are the most imperiled and that need to be saved. And the reason that I mention it is that this sort of inherently reactive and crisis-driven mode that we are constantly in is so important to sort of keep in mind, because we tend to only value things once they become deeply imperiled. And we take sort of the intact condition for granted. And we're all familiar as conservation biologists with the sort of process of disruption of connectivity. We have intact landscapes that start out in whole, and then we carve this out bit by bit. And at the beginning of this process, we don't really have to worry about connectivity at all. Connectivity is built in, it's inherent to the notion of intactness. But it's about when we get to a perforation, that we have to start actively managing, we have to actively restore, actively maintain the semblances of connectivity that are there. And then at some point, when it gets really bad, we actually have to rebuild and restore. So, that's kind of how we work. And aquatic connectivity works the same way. And we haven't talked too much about aquatic connectivity in this series, but my colleagues who study sturgeon in the East, have put together a terrific video that shows, like, when you have uninterrupted waterscapes and riverscapes where lake sturgeon, very vulnerable species, are able to flow, how different things look once you build barriers into these systems. And then you have to do a lot of things to get that back. And so that kind of notion of intactness is something that we are arguing to ensure that we can not lose sight of. And it's really this notion of ecological integrity. And that's where the structure and function and composition of original landscapes or waterscapes are similar, are maintained in their natural ranges of variation. And so what I mean by that, if you talk about the structure, you're talking about sort of the physical organization, the connectivity, the inherent within that, the spatial arrangement of components, function as nutrient cycle, productivity, pollination, animal movements, ability to be maintained throughout there. And then composition is sort of the identity and variety of biota, how much that has, sort of, been the same as it was previously, rather than introducing new biota, taxa, biomass, and so forth. And in this vein, ecological integrity is really in a continuum. And you have to think of it that way because it's not sort of a binary in that kind of context, but one that maintains high integrity is in sustained good health. That the biodiversity embodies, all these functions and structure and composition that's similar. And then it's like the naturalness of an ecosystem. And the more it is modified by human activity, the more you get to the left side, the more it moves away from natural range of variability. The loss of integrity is sort of the same as degradation. And then any increases along to the right side are representing recovery. And so that helps to sort of think about as a continuum rather than a binary thing. And how do we measure this? At first glance, it seems like would be quite challenging an abstract concept to measure in practice. But if we approached it head on, we would need to make a variety of direct measures to characterize structure, function, and composition. And that is, in most cases, especially if you're looking at the scale that is needed, really too costly to do. We don't have the remote sensing techniques, although they're starting to get there. A lot of this requires field measures that really can only be localized, field or indigenous knowledge that is really right on the ground and not necessarily at this largest scales. And then also integrity then can be measured by proxy measures, which if you can do that with good accuracy, and if we have good understanding of what the impacts of these kind of composite measures of damaging human pressures are on biota and structure and function, then that works fairly well. And certainly evidence is amassing a broad and growing literature that using pressures to indicate biodiversity outcomes, species and ecosystems, that it makes sense because there are good relationships that are emerging, and you can measure that at various scales. And indeed, this growing literature, and this is very biased towards forests and also global forests, but titles of a few key species that really a few key papers that demonstrate these core points. That when all these factors are absent, there are really very few remaining sources of human impact in an area. So it's reasonable to include that the integrity of an area and hence its biodiversity value remains in reasonably healthy condition, and that a higher end of the ecological integrity spectrum. We've had a chance to dabble in some of the measures. There are more and more emerging as some of the remote measures, sensing techniques get better. And in a recent paper looking specifically at forests, at the Forest Landscape Integrity Index, this map of pressures, human pressures that focus specifically on forests. And these place forest pixels worldwide on a scale from 0 to 10, again on that continuum concept. Canada looks pretty damn good on the global scale, but I'll have more to say about that in a moment. From a methodology perspective, a few points, and you can look into this more detail on the website. I'm not going to go into the details of this right now, but they're mostly these pressure indices, which then have to be measured at a global scale in order to generate these kinds of maps. But they are in certain, they're different elements of the structure and function and composition using proxy measures, including landscape connectivity. A couple of points to make from a Canada perspective is that in the forest base map, we have to, at the outset, remove some of the temporary disturbances, in particular fires, so that fire and anthropogenic disturbance are not conflated in this kind of metric, because that has happened previously. But also the open street map, which is a crowdsourced, data layer, has its limitations, of course, in Canada. And this is one of the major reasons why Canada looks so great globally, and where we can call that into question with better data. And you know, it is all about roads. I mean, Canada on the face of it, and also sort of our profile globally, we look like, you know, a low density country with tons of wilderness, and indeed, you know, where the highest densities of populations lie relative to the border with the US, it looks pretty low footprint. But when you add the resource roads on top of that, other highways and so forth, it becomes a different picture. And those metrics are not often reflected in these global maps. If we dive into this a little bit deeper, let's look at government of British Columbia in particular, and you can see like the ordinary global maps where it looks like British Columbia has very, very few roads. And even when you add national road layers on top of that, so ones that are curated by you know, national agencies in Canada, it is you know, a little bit more accurate, but even so. And then OpenStreetMap does improve this situation a little bit better. Those are this crowdsourced data. You can see that in the green. But where you really understand sort of the footprint layer, in particularly as it is reflected by roads, you really need the local scale data, provincial. And this provincially maintained data set provides the best information, especially on these resource roads. But this is not universally the case in Canada. In many of the provinces and territories, they do not have this level of detail. It's not possible to find it. OpenStreetMap provides the best coverage, but it's still not enough, and it still disguises a lot of this loss of integrity through roads that we're talking about here. And still, despite this, even then, even when you've got relatively good road layers, many roads are still not found in the best data sets because they have been newly created or there's other reasons. I mean, this is just a look at the Kootenays in particular, where in the east, where you've got roads that are clearly visible on satellite imagery, but aren't mapped in OpenStreetMap or, you know, or such. And generally speaking, unless you do the painstaking analysis every year to do via satellites, this huge country does not have cohesive and accurate data at the national scale, and certainly does not feed into global maps. And so that's why we can tend to look a little bit better than we are. Another point that has been made in Ontario is that even where the roads are known, when we think, how do we even, when they're not even used anymore, when do they become not roads? And it's not as simple as that, because a lot of them stay open for various reasons. They're not well recovered. They don't get on that a trajectory very well. Plus, they're used by others, and so this aggregate picture is concerning in that sense, in terms of being able to understand and map where our high integrity areas are. And why does this matter? I mean, roads matter as really keystone elements of development trajectories in any given landscape. We heard one of the presentations, I believe it was last week, showed in the Kootenays these sort of the history of road development and how it affected grizzlies in that particular instance. But sort of was a story of this one road after another and the growth-inducing impacts of these roads. Just as soon as they're built, they do indeed come, and in ways that are not necessarily anticipated, but they're also designed for that purpose. And these keystone environmental decisions, and they can be roads, they can be transmission lines in certain cases, they by themselves over time, and sometimes very quickly, result in making a whole lot of other development much more attractive than it would be. The width of that red line indicates development zone of influence and the magnitude of impact. And so you can see that, you know, that just multiplies over time by the introduction of one road, or one piece of linear infrastructure. And this matters because roads are rarely really deliberately considered in planning in the way that is you know, in keeping with the impacts that they have. They're generally considered givens. You know, in forest management planning, they're the last thing often to be you know, baked into a plan. They're not necessarily considered early on at key points when harvest levels and so on is dictated. When they're put in as access roads for particular areas to open up mining and so on, the growth-inducing impact potential is never considered. It's really the length of the road which dictates the potential size of the project and how much attention it will receive in an impact assessment, for example. And then also there's so many programs that subsidize the building of roads for the purpose of opening up new areas. And so these keystone decisions are very important, but our planning processes don't reflect that. But one good thing, and this is sort of a really positive development in light of all of this concern, is that the notion of ecological integrity, which by definition really does mean that in order to keep it, that road access management and so forth would need to be very carefully considered. It is becoming increasingly apparent in policies and tools. And I'll give you a little bit of a roadmap to that, because this is a development that we should be celebrating, but also paying some attention to, because it is contrary to the notion of, well, we'll wait for things to get bad before we value them. But it also notices that high ecological integrity areas are becoming more and more scarce at a global scale. They're degrading. And so in that case, then they're becoming more important to preserve more deliberately. Now, the first part of the story is that, similarly to Rob Ament's story about how Canada was out in front and back with these structures that for connectivity, Canada was also out in front when it comes to bringing ecological integrity in our policies. Parks Canada was, back in 1988, it was responsible for ecological integrity, first entering parks legislation at that time. And mainly it was focused on being a priority in park zoning and visitor use management. So it was somewhat limited in its use. But then provisions that were added in 2001 included a definition for ecological integrity, which is maintained today, and also an operative provision setting maintenance or restoration of ecological integrity as the first priority in parks management generally. And this has been very influential. It's been influential on other laws. It's been influential globally, and very significant move quite a long time ago. But other than parks legislation, there hasn't been all that much activity otherwise. And but a significant occurrence over the last year and a half was culminated in Montreal in 2022, which was the signing of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Probably a number of you were there at that time. Canada was a world leader for Indigenous-led conservation on the stage, for co-hosting this huge event where 180 some odd ministers from around the world came and agreed on a fairly transformational framework in which ecological integrity was for the first time mentioned in several places. Now, it's worth noting that, although there were 23 targets, or there are 23 targets in this framework, the one that has the most attention is the target 3, or the 30%, the so-called 30 by 30, because this is in lands and waters. And many equate the Global Biodiversity Framework with that target. But what about the other 70% is one question that comes to mind. And there are many elements of the Global Biodiversity Framework that speak to the need and the interest in, maintaining integrity, restoring, and essentially for the goal of halting and reversing biodiversity decline. And this just sort of high level way that it's structured, with a 2050 vision, 4 goals towards 2050 as well, but then a 2030 mission and a 2023 interim targets. This is where the meat of the matter is. And ecological integrity is deliberately mentioned among the 4 goals, particularly for goal A, along with connectivity, by the way, because it depends on which landscape, but it's right there at the top. It is not defined formally in the framework yet, but there's work to be done on that, and also a monitoring framework that has merged at the same time, which I won't get into. But then also among the 23 targets, 3 in particular mention ecological integrity. One that's much more proactive. It talks about it in the context of spatial planning, in the sense that, understanding, keeping, maintaining high integrity areas where they occur across the globe is an essential part of achieving the halting and the reversing of biodiversity decline. Without that, if you just wait until everything gets endangered to be able to then protect it or in bad shape, that won't be good enough. And so that was just a explicit recognition in one of the targets. The other 2 targets are more restoration oriented, but they also highlight ecological integrity as the so-called recovery goal, if you will. And in that case, ecological integrity is a very important role there, because it shows that, ecosystem health and the health of biodiversity writ large is very important to get more upwards on the trajectory as a key component of halting and reversing biodiversity loss. And Canada is obliged as a signatory to both the Global Biodiversity Framework and the Convention on Biological Diversity itself to implement the GBF. They are in the process right now, the federal government, of leading the design of a national biodiversity strategy, which probably many know about. And so this will be the chance to see how these targets will be implemented. We've seen a few drafts already. There is acknowledgement of ecological integrity. There's also acknowledgement of the particular responsibility that Canada has as one of the few countries, I mean, it's obviously a large one, containing a significant portion of so-called wilderness, another sort of term for these large wild natural areas. And in that vein, a very important responsibility globally. There's so many services in these areas that go beyond biodiversity, also carbon storage. And so the essential role of this nature, also for human health and so on, is becoming increasingly evident to the world. And Canada's responsibility is quite clear in this respect. So we'll be seeing how that plays out when this strategy emerges in a few months, and then how it is implemented at the provincial and territorial scale. And speaking of provinces, province of BC kind of snuck out from behind in November, quietly releasing a draft biodiversity and ecosystem health framework. The comments were due in January, and it was sort of a feeler to see, I would imagine, to give some sense of some kind of potential for transformational change for the benefit of biodiversity and ecosystem health. I don't expect you to read any of these. I imagine many of you saw this, but what is important, in this one statement of intent is the extent to which ecosystem health and ecological integrity shows up as words in this framework, and in particular, the notion of committing to the conservation and management of ecosystem health and biodiversity is an overarching priority that will be formalized through legislation and other enabling tools that apply to and can be accessed by all sectors. In order to do that, in order to meet that aspiration, that requires a very significant difference to the status quo that I described previously. It means the management, proactive planning of roads, among other developments, at earlier stages of consideration for the benefit of broader biodiversity and climate. Another push that's happening is more on the other side of the continuum, which is about forest degradation. And ever since the UN Convention on Climate Change, the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change was born in 1992, the same year as the Convention on Biological Diversity, the notion of the contribution of land use change and forestry to the climate goals and its relationship has been very well known. But traditionally, the focus has been mostly on deforestation, outright deforestation, and the focus has been mostly in the tropics. And there, it's quite evident, we've had significant deforestation that's contributed to the climate crisis, much of it at the agricultural frontier. And in this situation, that becomes very obvious, and where Canada has been able to say that, that deforestation has not been significant up here at all in modern times. And most of the forest removal, it gets replaced through forest renewal and so forth, particularly in a forestry context. And so we've looked very good in that conversation, but increasingly forest degradation is in the conversation. And so it's both deforestation and degradation in the same kind of mouthful. And in this sense, we've had various declarations from the New York one in 2014 to the Glasgow one. FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, has been working on this, trying to define this, trying to assemble statistics on it. But suffice it to say that the term of forest degradation in particular has been being discussed increasingly. Just this past year, however, the conversation changed even further when the European Commission released a regulation on deforestation-free products. But in there's also talking about products including wood that contribute to deforestation or forest degradation worldwide. So this will include all forests. And while it's very early days, forest degradation is defined in this regulation. And it is, something of potential interest in terms of governing some of the issues related to, where Canada will have to demonstrate that forest degradation is not occurring. And so this is just another example of sort of, maybe global pressures that are happening, often more attention on tropics, at least at the beginning, but where Canada either has an outsized responsibility for conserving ecological integrity, or where Canada is potentially vulnerable from the point of view of potentially showing that there is evidence for degradation, and that's a really key element. When we go to tools, that's sort of the policy kind of framework, but we also, ecological integrity is coming into play with tools, and one of the key ones is key biodiversity areas. It's a global standard that was developed quite some time ago, but then recast in 2016 with a different set of criteria that was amalgamating all other criteria, sort of other standards for important areas. And it's about sites that contribute significantly to the persistence of biodiversity. And it was through a global consultation process that the standard was developed. It is global and being applied at various scales, in particular at the country level. Now, the thing that's worth noting here is that while the original KBA framework and the standard was really developed a lot around the notion of emergency room, so very similar to what I've been talking about in this theme, the hotspot idea that really it's only once you've got very imperiled species that live only in certain areas or aggregate where other areas or range has disappeared to this certain extent, where it becomes important enough to call it key. But in this case, there's also a criteria that was developed during the course of this this initiative that focuses on ecological integrity with a similar mindset than what I've been talking about here, is that it's not enough to talk about these other areas that are imperiled, and it's not enough to be thinking about restoration, but we really have to be focused also on those areas that are still in excellent shape, that are still in areas that are important to maintain, where we don't have to face the specter of restoration nearly to the same extent. And the methodology for that, particularly in Canada, and this is something that Lucy Pulley is leading, but there are many other folks involved, is at first glance very similar to what you might expect. And knowing where our highest integrity areas are in Canada is not rocket science, although there is better and better data that show this and show these areas that are important. And these all happen to be areas where, or most of them happen to be areas where Indigenous peoples are the key. These are huge territories for Indigenous people, but also who are the most responsible for those areas in the sense of have been keeping their in time immemorial. They have not been, So these areas are obviously the where we're focusing on for criterion C KBAs, but really there's so much more to do that has to be regionally tailored, because they will vary regionally across. And this is where biocultural indicators become so important, because these are areas that steps needed to identify where which of the indicators are tailored for those regions, and they can be anything from biological to cultural and everything in between. Locating specific spatial data, but that are going to be very useful for exactly those areas. But it's challenging to apply those because it's so much variability across that vast expanse of high ecological integrity. And the notion of tailoring it to particular areas where that have different biological and biocultural context is something that has been of significant focus in this work at to date. And you can learn more about all that at kbacanada.org, but also stay tuned because of this. This is still developing. And just as my sort of last kind of couple of minutes to go again to the other criteria, and even so, the species level criteria, so places where species are that are very important within the range of species that are deeply imperiled, or their groups or endemic, or have places where they aggregate, have been it has been a terrific exercise to be identifying these across the country, talking with local or knowledge holders and rights holders about their importance. And in the Kootenays, the map looks a little bit like this. I mean, you look at the roaded area, and around there you've got the pink and the green areas, which are either draft or confirmed KBAs in this region. And then you look at that against where the protected areas are in the other green. And in this context, you can see that there are quite a lot of areas that are key and important for imperiled species that have not yet been protected in the Kootenays. And why does that matter for connectivity? I mean, sometimes these KBAs represent some of the most important, sometimes the only remaining concentrations of rare and threatened species, and not the high profile ones, but really ones that are not as well known. Everything from lichen to insects to amphibians and so forth. And especially in the South, these important sites are often isolated, and the Kootenays are a great example for that. And for long-term persistence of these biodiversity that's held within these KBAs, it's important to be connected to the landscape to avoid this long-term isolation of these vulnerable populations, to allow those interactions, allow rescue effects, and generally allow these ecological processes to occur as sort of the first stepping stone to restoring ecological integrity. And as we build corridors, as we've talked about during this entire set of presentations this winter, and connectivity, and hopefully within a more proactive land use planning of the kind that BC is envisioning within its transformational framework, prioritizing KBAs into these corridors, both to address the issues that I just talked about in terms of their isolation, but also more generally to include these most important places for biodiversity into areas that are managed for ecological processes and connectivity. And if they're more deliberate about that in terms of building, then they can include many other biodiversity values that we don't even know about. With that, I just want to thank everybody for this, and just conclude by saying that there is, the key point that I'm trying to convey is that there's just such increasing recognition at a global scale that we can't no longer take ecological integrity for granted. And we have examples of that within Canada, where we've taken our resources for granted, and then all of a sudden we don't have them anymore. And Canada still represents incredible opportunity at the global scale. And we as conservation biologists, we're much more bred to be thinking about the crisis, to do cleanup, and to do the hardest work as cheerfully as possible after others have had their fill. And so the key message is that we have to do both. We have to have both in mind so that we don't succumb to a sliding baseline or shifting baseline, so that we don't forget the way that it was and is supposed to be as we seek to restore. But then we also need to demand these proactive processes proactive decision-making. It's time for that. And some policies are showing that at global scale and even here in Canada. So paying attention to that, seeing how we can implement that, it's very, very hard work, but there's so much to do at this stage. So I really appreciate, again, having being part of this whole session that you've put together. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Justina. That was fabulous presentation, and really appreciate the emphasis on intactness and ecological integrity and wildness and its relationship to biodiversity and connectivity, and just weaving together all the topics from previous webinars. Just really a great way to end our webinar series. So I really appreciate you being here. And good, Lucy has joined us. So we have about 10 minutes or so left for questions. So we'll jump right in. And the one I'd like to start with, Justina, is ecosystem health versus ecosystem integrity. Are they interchangeable? When is one used versus the other?
In many ways, they're interchangeable. It's really like I had a line in there that, you know, in sort of regular terms. I think health really means something to people, you know, and it is inherently about health. And interestingly, in this day and age after the pandemic, we also understand, and I didn't get into that here at all, but certainly globally, there is an excellent relationship that's being more and more understood between ecosystem integrity that I described and human health. You know, when we start to disrupt ecosystems, go into places to mix species together and so on, those are quite literally the places where we have the highest chance of pathogen spillover. There's lots of good examples of that. And so you can really make that connection very clearly there. And I would just say that you could use those terms interchangeably, and it is something that just means more to sort of the average person, I would imagine.
Okay, great. There are a bunch of questions, so I encourage people to use the upvote function so we can start to prioritize them. Here's another one for you, Justina. In your opinion, which type of industry concerns you the most that contributes to fragmentation, climate change, and other anthropogenic effects, like forestry, mining, agriculture, land development? What do you?
I would say like it's always particular to the region, and it's almost always cumulative. And if we isolate different industry, you can have circumstances where one would be more important than the other in a different context, but that cumulatively they're way more important than either of them by themselves. And even, you know, in this landscape, for example, in the Kootenays, where we're talking about the role of recreation, for example, which is an important factor that can have an additive effect on everything else as well. And you know, you wouldn't by itself talk about recreation as being a problem, but in certain contexts, it absolutely can be. And so I think that's a really great example of something that acts like that.
Okay. Here's a bit of a long one, but I'll read through it. How do you see BC and other jurisdictions in Canada reconciling the expedited development pressures under the auspices of housing availability and affordability with national and provincial biodiversity commitments? This person says, I work for a rapidly growing city in BC, and with the new legislated housing mandates, proactive and progressive environmental and conservation-based policies and bylaws are all being rapidly eroded under the banner of housing requirements.
Oh gosh, yeah. So that's an easy question. So and a really topical one, because you could almost put any industry in that. Talk about critical minerals, for example. You know, that is now huge pressures for that development as well, but in the name of furnishing other needs that we have. And I would say that recognizing the key culprit of where we are now that has engendered these cumulative effects is this piecemeal approach that we take in almost every decisions that we make. And it may be you know, one housing development at a time, one road at a time, one forest management plan at a time in isolation of the 2 mines that are also in the area and the 3 roads and so forth. We have no choice but to, if we want to disrupt that pattern, to be, working at different scales and with a different set of priorities at the top of that. And that is partly what the BC framework that I talked about, it with all its vagary, it has no details at all, but it professes to want to do that. And in order to do that, it would have to have a sea change. I think in the urban context that you speak of, there's also the notion of how we take advantage of places that have already been developed, and what are the trade-offs between the sprawl and the densification kind of situation. And at least here in Ontario, for anybody who's aware of this, there's a ton of misinformation out there about what are the root causes of the pickle that we're in, both financial and environmental, what are and all of these factors that are very difficult to pick through and to sort through and really understand. But it's absolutely necessary for any decision maker to be clear about what is actually happening, why we are in this place, and what are some of the options to get there that aren't necessarily about making things faster decision making and more of it, right? There are other pathways, and they will lead there if the problems are understood and not masked by a lot of misinformation. I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah. Oh, it has me thinking of the whole Greenbelt fiasco. Yeah. Okay. I think that person was from the Okanagan, and it's a bustling place right now in terms of needs for housing. So here's another one from your friend Mike Proctor. Considering measurable progress towards ecological integrity, health, and 30 by 30, does landscape connectivity have a place? Is there a mechanism or definition of connectivity that can be measured and used to document progress?
So those are 2 different questions. I'll answer the first one best. Certainly connectivity is a place. I didn't talk about that deliberately within the global biodiversity framework, but the point that I did try to drive home is that in different contexts, connectivity is going to be important. And so that graphic that I showed at the beginning really is about, those areas that are at the higher end of the ecological integrity spectrum, that those we're talking about maintaining them, and we don't need to be worrying so much about connectivity in that circumstance. It is inherently connected, hopefully. It is really when you get to start to getting eroded, and there's plenty of places like that all over the world where you absolutely have to deliberately bring in connectivity. Yeah. And that is recognized in the global biodiversity framework, as are some metrics. I mean, the metrics part of that framework are being dealt with sort of separately. It's a clumsy process, and sometimes there's a tail wagging the dog element in them. And also remember that it's a global framework, and so some of the metrics that work globally are kind of meaningless at a scale even of Canada, let alone BC and other places. So that's partly what we wanted to show with the roads data, that we can get all excited about the high ecological integrity that we have at the global scale, but when we look more clearly at it with data sets that matter at these smaller scales, it becomes a different story. Would say the same with connectivity.
Yeah. Okay. I think one of the concerns is in the BC Biodiversity and Ecosystem Health Framework. It's implied that it should be included in integrity, ecological integrity, but connectivity, if you did a word search, you won't find it. So I guess what Michael's, and I have been trying to do is how to bring that aspect of our work out, because it does, as you said, at some place on that continuum, connectivity then becomes really important in terms of keeping pieces together and unfragmenting. Yeah, landscapes.
Yeah, so that's the restoration element, which is pretty significant there. That's a short draft, and it will need considerable detail, but it would not be in violation of what has already happened to be able to put that in there deliberately. But when you restore, you have you have to start with connectivity. There's just no way that I'm not start with it, but that has to be one element. Absolutely. And that's partly what we've been trying to show here with also, we have the KBAs that are anchors, but all of these presentations have shown so clearly during this winter series that building how critical it is and successful it is. That is a fantastic first step towards getting on that ecological integrity spectrum. Lucy, do you have anything to add to that? Putting you on the spot? You're good? Okay, I just want to make sure.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more. So one more here. Again, I'll have to read through it for you. So achieving protected areas target seems more doable at a larger scale, i.e. Crown land. But for local governments, reducing fragmentation and acquiring large enough biodiversity hotspots and connectivity corridors is extremely challenging, as the land is worth more with houses on it versus nature. But there isn't acquisition funding opportunities for urban municipalities the way that there is for other areas. How do you see local governments moving past this?
Well, so first I want to corroborate that feeling, because one of the dangers of the 30 by 30 push is that there's elements of it that are an accounting exercise, right? And so that bigger is better, and they're not even necessarily always focused on quality. So that is sort of a perverse outcome of this high ambition, if you will. That said, if you're at this area where you place that you describe, these small areas, it doesn't matter the size, these areas are very, very important to piece together. And there's so many examples of how that dogged persistence has been so beneficial with time and being able to piece these together. And that has to come from also, first and foremost, I think local interest as well. But there are important parts of the framework that focus on urban areas, and that is a nice part of the global biodiversity framework. It's also celebrated to a certain extent in the early drafts that we've seen of the national biodiversity strategy. So again, it's there. It's about drawing it out and making it a priority. But you can put a through line from that global interest in restoring urban areas and ensuring that nature is there, because we've seen the importance of it through the pandemic, but also for people's connections to nature writ large, that it is absolutely critical to focus on those areas. And the global biodiversity framework recognizes this.
Okay, two more, Justina, because I want to respect your time and
all
Lucy's.
good, all good,
okay.
all good. This is fun.
I worry that we as scientists spend so much of our time developing thresholds and criteria for biodiversity indicators, but that not enough emphasis and funding is placed on the monitoring, reporting, and follow through to adaptive management to address the problems that are so apparent. It seems that in BC, governments are not following through on even the legal minimum forest retention targets. So how do we hold them to task?
Oh my gosh, you're singing from yes, it's absolutely, like, the monitoring is just not sexy. And we do quite a bit of it ourselves on certain taxa, certain areas, and finding the people, cobbling together the money. In some cases, when we're even doing what we see as government job is certainly an issue, right? And I don't have the answer to that, except that we have to keep calling for how important it is. The sort of glimmer is that there is more and more attention on demonstrating success. Like, all of these targets have some degree of accountability in them, and Canada is itself more focused on that. The province is not so much. They're not investing in it enough, but I think those of us from the outside have to be showing that more and more why that's important. And there's certainly many in the inside of government who would who do that more, and where that information needs to come out too. That's the other thing. There's tons of of knowledge within government that doesn't necessarily come out. And so that needs to also be encouraged.
Thanks. So have any governments in Canada established laws for the maximum road density thresholds that can be enforced in wildland areas?
The only ones that I'm
I got a
aware
second
of,
part to that, but I'll give you the first part.
the only ones that I'm aware of are those that have been agreed to within a land use planning context. So, it wouldn't happen at a statute level. And no, I have not seen that, nor do I necessarily think that the threshold approach is always the best one. And it needs to be tailored for particular areas, and it's often so difficult to ascertain what that threshold is. But of course, legal frameworks always want that. But we tend to put the burden of proof on science on that, and the uncertainty attached to those thresholds is so immense that we could be making mistakes with those and not being cautious enough in certain circumstances.
And Lucy, do you have anything to add to that, since you've looked at roads so much? Road density?
Yeah, I think Justina's right. I think it's at regional scale, not anything provincial or national. We don't even have a good estimate of what the road density is in most of these areas. So to create a threshold at a broad scale would be extremely challenging.
Okay. And as a follow-up, this person's wondering about, are there any laws or requirements to have a minimum number of wildlife crossings per number of kilometers of highway?
I have not seen any, but I'm sure there are others that if there were, I hope people pipe up, but not in this country that I'm aware of. But there are calls to build that in and not necessarily as numbers and thresholds, but as a requirement, for example, for new roads. And certainly that's happening more and more. It's like when you build a new road, that's part of the mitigation strategy. That's becoming more and more evident.
Okay. If you have time, there's one more that some people have upvoted on that I'd like to make sure you answer, and then we'll call it a wrap. So again, sort of long, but I'll read through it. Local authorities and Indigenous communities are on the front line of managing the negative impacts of environmental degradation over time, yet have very little capacity to affect change within their respective levels of authority. With implementation of natural and provincial biodiversity conservation strategies, do you see the potential for increased agency in land management decisions at local and regional scales? For example, the designation of wildlife corridors within land management policies would be a very important first step.
Well, when jurisdictions in Canada, I mean, a common refrain that you see in many strategies is that we can't do this alone. And so that, you see that all the time. And so putting, having them commit to that, if that is the case, then having people implement these very important actions at various scales is critical. The global biodiversity framework is scalable. I mean, like you can do this at various scales. There are ways in which this can be implemented at the smallest scales, at the municipality and so on. But it's also evident that though that scale of management is going to be absolutely critical for many of the actions. And so being both aware of those, being aware of the commitments that the provinces or even Canada have made is a first step. I can never predict, but I certainly hope so, because that's where that's the front lines, as this person said, and it's absolutely critical. And as we've seen so many examples of that, awe-inspiring examples of that in this webinar series, and every single presentation, which I was really grateful to see.
Thank you so much. On that note, I'm going to remind folks that Kendall has put a survey link into the chat. We would really like your feedback on this webinar series that we've done. It really helps us to evaluate what you liked and didn't like, and helps us with planning future events. So thank you for that. So Justina and Lucy, thank you so much for being here today, for all that you've shared and that you do. And this has really been a nice final webinar to our series. It puts a capstone on it. So again, really appreciate you both being here and the care that you've taken with your presentation. So I would like to, on behalf of CMI and KCP, let everybody know that this is the end of our series. Thanks for being here today with us. And for those folks who have gone the journey or part of the journey with us since January to learn all about wildlife corridors and ecological connectivity, I think it's been a great winter of learning. And I hope you have a great rest of the day and happy spring. Thank you very much.